The house on Cedar Lane had stood empty for decades, its boarded windows and sagging roof a symbol of whispered legends in the small town of Millhaven. Locals called it the Watcher's House, a place where no one lingered after dark. But for Ava, a freelance writer chasing a viral story, the house was a golden opportunity. It started with a single, cryptic email. No sender, no subject, just a message. They're watching. Always have been. Ava's curiosity got the better of her. After a little digging, she discovered that the Watcher's house had a long history of strange disappearances and inexplicable phenomena. Rumors claimed that anyone who dared to sleep inside never made it out. Determined to prove it was nothing more than local superstition, Ava packed her camera, notebook, and a flashlight and headed for the house on a cold November night. The air felt heavy as she approached, the kind of oppressive stillness that made her question her resolve. But she shook off her nerves and stepped inside. The interior was worse than she expected, walls warped with mold, floorboards creaking under every step. She set up her equipment in the living room, an eerie space dominated by an old, dust-covered armchair facing a shattered window. The room felt wrong, as though the air itself recoiled from her presence. Still, she pressed on, starting her camera and speaking directly into the lens. It's said that the Watcher's house chooses its victims. They say it's not haunted in the traditional sense. There's no ghost, no spirit. Instead, there's something alive here, something that sees. Tonight, I'll find out the truth. Hours passed in tense silence. Ava paced the house, taking notes and recording every creak and whisper of wind. Around midnight, she returned to the living room and noticed something strange. The armchair, once perfectly still, now faced slightly toward her. She brushed it off. Her own movements must have jostled the old furniture. But then she saw the first note. A single sheet of yellowed paper sat on the seat of the chair. She hadn't put it there. Trembling, she picked it up. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were 3 words: "Stop looking. Leave." Her first instinct was to flee, but the rational part of her mind insisted it was a prank. Someone in town must have followed her, hoping to scare her off. "Nice try," she muttered, stuffing the note in her bag. But as the hours crept by, the house seemed to awaken. The temperature dropped sharply, and shadows moved where no light should reach. At 3 a.m., Ava heard the distinct sound of footsteps above her. She froze. There had been no one upstairs when she arrived. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. Gathering her courage, she climbed the rickety staircase, flashlight beam slicing through the dark. At the top, she found a long hallway lined with closed doors. The footsteps had stopped, but the oppressive feeling was stronger now. She opened the nearest door. The room was empty save for another note pinned to the wall with a rusted nail. This one read, "They see you now." Ava backed out of the room, her heart pounding. The house groaned, and she could feel eyes on her, though she was alone. She bolted down the stairs, only to find the front door wouldn't budge. Desperation clawed at her as she yanked and pulled, but it was as though the house itself held her captive. A soft, rasping sound drew her attention back to the living room. The armchair had turned fully toward her now. A figure sat in it, its form obscured by darkness but unmistakably human-shaped. "Who are you?" she whispered, clutching her flashlight like a weapon. The figure didn't move, but a deep, resonant voice filled the room. "I've always been here." The flashlight flickered and died. Ava screamed, fumbling for her phone, but it slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. She felt the air grow heavier, the walls closing in. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was the armchair, empty once more. Days later, her camera was found outside the house, still recording. The footage showed Ava speaking into the lens, followed by hours of static. Toward the end, a voice whispered faintly, "You can't escape what sees everything." Ava was never seen again.
Story number 2.
The man had been driving for hours, his headlights cutting through the thick fog that clung to the winding back roads. Michael had made a mistake, trusting his GPS to take him on the fastest route home. The landscape around him was desolate. No streetlights, no houses, just endless trees pressing in on both sides. The radio, once playing static-laden music, had gone silent, as if even the airwaves refused to linger here. The only sound was the rhythmic crunch of gravel under his tires. Michael checked the dashboard clock. 2:46 a.m. He sighed, gripping the wheel tighter. He should have been home by now. That's when he saw her. She appeared suddenly in his high beams, standing in the middle of the road. A woman, barefoot and dressed in a long, tattered white gown. Her head was tilted down, hair obscuring her face. Michael slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt mere feet from her. His heart raced as he stared at the figure. "Jesus," he muttered, rolling down his window. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond, didn't move. Something about her was off. Her gown looked damp, clinging to her thin frame, and her skin had a pallid, almost bluish hue. Michael hesitated, but decided to step out. He couldn't just leave her there, not in the middle of nowhere. "Miss?" he said, approaching cautiously. The air was icy, colder than it should have been for early autumn. He noticed now that her feet were covered in dirt and scratches, as if she'd been running through the woods. "Are you lost? Do you need a ride?" Still, she didn't answer. Instead, she raised her head slightly, enough for him to catch a glimpse of her face. Her eyes? They weren't right. Hollow and dark, like two empty sockets that stretched endlessly inward. Michael stumbled back, his blood turning to ice. "What the?" Before he could finish, the woman let out a low, guttural sound, a noise that didn't belong in the throat of anything human. It reverberated through the trees, and suddenly she wasn't alone. Shapes began to emerge from the fog, more figures stepping onto the road. Men, women, even children, all with the same empty eyes and lifeless expressions. Panic surged through Michael. He bolted for his car, slamming the door and locking it in one frantic motion. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he floored it, swerving around the woman in white. For a brief moment, he thought he was safe. The figures disappeared in his rearview mirror, swallowed by the fog. But then, the radio crackled. At first, it was just static, but soon, a voice emerged, a distorted, broken whisper. "You can't run." Michael's stomach dropped. He glanced in the mirror again, and his heart nearly stopped. She was there, sitting in the back seat. Her face was inches from his, her hollow eyes boring into his own. He screamed, the car veering off the road and slamming into a tree. When the authorities found the wreck the next morning, they noted the strange details. The deep claw marks on the inside of the car doors, the shattered windshield with no blood trail, and Michael himself slumped over the wheel with an expression of sheer terror frozen on his face. The police chalked it up to an accident caused by sleep deprivation. But locals whispered a different story. They knew the legend of the woman in white, a restless spirit who wandered the back roads, searching for someone to take her place. And once she chose you, there was no escape.
Story number 3.
Lila loved her job as a night nurse. The quiet hours, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the stillness of the hospital gave her a sense of peace. St. Catherine's Memorial, however, had its quirks. Whispers among the staff about the North Wing. The abandoned section of the hospital was sealed off years ago after a fire left it in ruins. No one went there anymore. At least, no one was supposed to. One stormy night, just as her shift began, Lila was making her rounds on the 4th floor when the intercom crackled to life. "Room 407, a distorted voice said. Lila froze. Room 407 was in the North Wing. The intercom system wasn't even connected to that part of the building anymore. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it as a glitch, and continued her work. But as the night wore on, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered and the temperature dropped, an icy chill creeping through the halls. At 3:13 a.m., her pager went off. The display read, "Room 407. Her heart pounded. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was a malfunction. But then she saw it, down the hall at the edge of the shadows. A figure stood motionless. It was tall and gaunt, dressed in what looked like an old hospital gown. "Who's there?" Lila called, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. Gathering her courage, she stepped closer. As she approached, the figure slowly raised a hand and pointed to a door at the end of the hallway. "Room 407. "No," she whispered, backing away. But when she blinked, the figure was gone. Lila's curiosity got the better of her. Against every instinct screaming at her to turn back, she found herself walking toward the North Wing. The heavy double doors creaked open under her touch, revealing a dark, dilapidated corridor. The smell of burnt wood and mildew filled her nostrils. Her flashlight illuminated the faded numbers on the doors as she walked. 405. 407. The door was ajar, its paint blistered and peeling. Inside, the room was empty except for an old hospital bed and a single chair by the window. The air was thick, oppressive. On the bed lay a file folder, its edges singed. Lila picked it up and opened it. Her blood ran cold. It was a patient file. The photo clipped to the front was a picture of her, smiling in her nurse's uniform. The details below were impossible. It listed her date of birth, her address, and her date of death. Today's date. The room's door slammed shut and the lights flickered out. Lila spun around, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The figure from the hallway was there, closer now. Its face was wrong, mouth stretched too wide, eyes sunk in black voids. It moved toward her, slow and deliberate. She screamed, backing into the corner. "This isn't real," she cried. The figure leaned in, its cold breath brushing her ear. "It is now." Lila's coworkers found her the next morning, sitting in the corner of room 407. Her hair had turned stark white, her eyes vacant. She muttered the same phrase over and over, barely above a whisper. "They never leave." The hospital closed down shortly after, the staff refusing to work nights anymore. To this day, no one knows how Lila ended up in the sealed-off North Wing or what she saw. But locals say that if you listen closely near the ruins of St. Catherine's Memorial, you can still hear her whispers echoing through the halls.
Story number 4.
Maggie had never been afraid of the dark. Growing up in the countryside, nights were inky, black, and silent, and she'd always found the solitude comforting. But that changed after she moved into the old house on Willow Creek Road. The house was a fixer-upper, with creaky floors and drafty windows, but Maggie loved its charm. It had stood empty for years before she bought it, the previous owners having vanished without a trace. Locals whispered strange stories about the place, but Maggie didn't believe in ghost tales. She was practical, grounded, or so she thought. The first few weeks were uneventful, save for the occasional odd sound in the night. A tapping at the windows, the faint creak of footsteps on the stairs when no one was there. She chalked it up to the house settling or animals outside. But then she found the mirror. It was hidden in the attic, buried under dusty sheets and broken furniture. The frame was ornate, carved with intricate vines that seemed to writhe under her touch. The glass was cracked in one corner, but when she looked into it, her reflection appeared normal at first. That night, as she brushed her teeth, Maggie felt uneasy. The mirror was now mounted in the hallway, just outside her bedroom. Out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw movement. She turned, but her reflection was still, staring back at her with wide, unblinking eyes. She laughed nervously. "You're imagining things," she muttered, heading to bed. At exactly 3 a.m., Maggie woke to the sound of soft whispering. It was faint, barely audible, but undeniably there. She sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The sound seemed to come from the hallway. Grabbing her phone for light, she stepped out of her room. The whispering stopped. She pointed the beam of her phone toward the mirror. Her reflection was there, staring back, but something was wrong. Her reflection's lips moved, mouthing words she couldn't hear. Maggie stepped closer, her pulse quickening. The reflection's expression twisted into something unnatural, a wide, sinister grin that didn't match the terror on Maggie's face. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have let me in." Maggie stumbled back, dropping her phone. The light flickered and went out. The hallway was pitch black. She scrambled to her feet and ran back to her bedroom, slamming the door shut. She sat on the floor, heart racing, listening to the silence. Minutes passed. Then she heard it. A knock, not on the door, but on the mirror inside her room. She turned slowly, her breath hitching. In the faint glow of moonlight, she saw it. The mirror stood propped against the wall, and her reflection was gone. Instead, a shadowy figure loomed within the glass, its hollow eyes fixed on her. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. Maggie screamed, grabbing the mirror and throwing it face down onto the floor. The knocking stopped. For the rest of the night, she sat in the corner, clutching a flashlight and praying for dawn. The next morning, she took the mirror to the backyard and smashed it to pieces. She felt a momentary relief, as if a weight had been lifted. But that night, as she got ready for bed, she froze. The mirror in her bathroom, one she hadn't touched, was fogged over as though someone had breathed on it, and scrawled in the condensation in jagged letters were 2 words, "I'm here." Maggie didn't sleep that night, or any night after. She left the house within days, abandoning everything she owned. It sits empty now, just as it did before, waiting for the next unsuspecting occupant.
Story number 5.
It started with a small noise, just a faint scratching sound coming from behind the walls. At first, Danny thought it was mice. Living alone in a century-old house came with its fair share of quirks, and he wasn't easily spooked. He set traps in the basement and went about his week without a second thought. But the scratching didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, and at night it seemed to move. Sometimes it came from the ceiling, sometimes from the floor, always following him no matter where he was in the house. By the fourth night, Danny could swear he heard it right next to his bed, just behind the drywall. Frustrated, he decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, he pried open the section of the wall where the noise seemed loudest. Dust and old insulation spilled out, but there was nothing unusual. No rodents, no droppings, just an empty void behind the plaster. "Guess it's just the house settling," he muttered, though he didn't believe it. That night, he was jolted awake by a sound that made his blood run cold, a low, guttural whisper. He froze, barely daring to breathe. The voice was faint, but he could make out the words, "Danny, come closer." He bolted upright, heart hammering. The room was dark and still. He fumbled for the light switch, bathing the space in yellow light. Nothing. The house was silent again, but the air felt heavier, oppressive. The next day, Danny tried to convince himself it was a dream, a trick of his overtired mind. But as night fell, he felt the dread creeping back. The scratching returned, accompanied this time by the faintest sound of breathing. Lying in bed, he clutched the blanket tightly, staring at the ceiling. He didn't sleep, and when dawn finally broke, he made a decision. He would get to the bottom of this, once and for all. He started tearing down walls. Room by room, he searched, uncovering the house's hidden skeleton. In the living room, he found an old box of photographs behind the plaster, black and white images of the house's former occupants, their faces strangely blurred. In the dining room, he unearthed a child's shoe, scuffed and worn, but too clean to have been there for decades. And then, in the basement, he found the door. It was small, barely visible behind a stack of rotting wood planks. The handle was rusted, and when Danny pulled it open, he was hit by a wave of cold air that smelled of earth and decay. The space beyond was pitch black, a narrow tunnel descending into the ground. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to leave it alone. But the whisper came again, louder this time. "Come closer." Gripping his flashlight, Danny stepped inside. The walls of the tunnel were damp, carved from packed dirt, and the air grew colder the deeper he went. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, and now he could make out other voices, a cacophony of murmurs, too many to count. The tunnel opened into a small chamber, and the beam of his flashlight fell on something that made his stomach churn. The walls were covered in scratch marks, as though someone or something had been clawing at them for years. In the center of the room stood a wooden chair, its seat stained dark with something he didn't want to identify. And then he saw the figure. It was hunched in the corner, its back to him, its body twisted and gaunt. It moved slightly, its head tilting as if it sensed his presence. Danny's flashlight flickered, and in the brief moment of darkness, he heard the voice again, right behind him this time. "You shouldn't have come." The light returned, and the figure was gone. But something else was there now. Long, pale fingers reaching from the shadows, wrapping around his ankle. Danny screamed, the sound echoing off the dirt walls as he was pulled into the darkness. Days later, the police arrived after Danny's neighbors reported hearing strange noises. They found his house in disarray, walls torn apart, and the basement door open. But there was no sign of Danny, just the faint scratching sound coming from deep within the tunnel.
Story number 6.
Sophia had always loved thrift shopping. The thrill of finding something unique, something with a history, was irresistible. That's why she couldn't pass up the ornate music box she spotted at the back of an old antique store. It was beautiful, carved with intricate floral patterns and inlaid with tiny glinting gemstones. When she wound it up, the box played a hauntingly sweet melody that made her shiver. The shopkeeper hesitated when she brought it to the counter. "Are you sure you want this one?" he asked, his voice low. Sophia laughed. "Why wouldn't I? It's gorgeous." The man didn't respond, just nodded and wrapped it up. As she left, she thought she heard him mutter something, but the words were lost in the creak of the door closing behind her. That night, Sophia placed the music box on her bedside table and wound it up again. The melody filled her small apartment, the notes delicate and melancholic. She smiled and went to bed, the tune echoing softly in her mind as she drifted off to sleep. But her dreams were anything but peaceful. She found herself in a dark, endless room, the walls lined with mirrors that reflected not her, but shadowy figures with hollow eyes. The music from the box played faintly in the background, growing louder as the figures began to move toward her. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. One of the figures reached out, its cold hand brushing her arm. Sophia woke with a start, her heart pounding. The music box was open on her bedside table, the melody still playing, but she hadn't touched it. Shaking off the dream, she closed the box and told herself it was just her imagination. The latch must have been loose, she reasoned. Still, an unease settled over her. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Doors she'd closed were open when she returned home. Objects moved from their places. And every night, the music box would somehow be open, the haunting tune filling the air. Sophia started having the same dream over and over. The mirrors, the figures, the cold touch. One evening, desperate for answers, she searched the music box for any clues. She pried open the bottom, hoping to find a maker's mark or something to explain its strange behavior. Instead, she found a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. On it was a single line, scrawled in jagged handwriting, "The melody binds them." Her breath hitched. She slammed the box shut and shoved it into her closet, determined to forget about it. But that night, the dreams returned, more vivid than ever. This time, the shadowy figures whispered to her, their voices overlapping in a discordant chorus, "Set us free." When she woke, the music box was on her bedside table again, wide open, the melody playing louder than ever. She screamed, grabbing it and throwing it against the wall. The lid snapped off and the music stopped abruptly. For a moment, the silence felt like relief, until she heard the knock. It came from her closet, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. Sophia froze, her eyes fixed on the closet door. The knock turned into a pounding, the wood rattling as though something inside was desperate to get out. Summoning every ounce of courage, she grabbed a lamp and flung the closet door open. The music box lay on the floor, shattered, its inner workings exposed. But the knocking didn't stop. It was coming from the back of the closet, from a dark, gaping hole she had never seen before. And then from the shadows she saw them, hands, pale and skeletal, reaching out toward her. The whispering began again, louder this time, a cacophony of voices begging, pleading, commanding, "Set us free!" The last thing Sophia saw before the hands pulled her into the darkness was her reflection in the shards of the broken music box. But it wasn't her face staring back. It was one of the shadowy figures, smiling. When her friends came looking for her days later, they found the apartment empty. The only thing left was the shattered music box, its melody faintly playing on an endless loop.
Story number 7.
Tom had never been a superstitious man. He prided himself on his logical mind and practical nature. So, when his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Harwood, warned him not to go into the woods behind their street after dark, he dismissed her with a polite smile. "It's not safe," she said, her voice shaking. "There's something out there, something that doesn't belong." Tom laughed it off, chalking her fears up to small-town folklore. The woods were peaceful, a stretch of towering pines and winding trails. He often jogged there in the evenings, enjoying the solitude. One chilly autumn night, Tom went for his usual run, losing track of time. By the time he realized how dark it had gotten, the path was barely visible. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes against the dim glow of the moon. He turned to head back, but stopped when he heard it, a soft, distant humming. It wasn't the wind or any animal he recognized. The sound was melodic, almost human. It seemed to drift through the trees, pulling him deeper into the forest. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing. There was no response, but the humming grew louder, closer. Against his better judgment, Tom followed the sound. The further he went, the colder it became. The air grew heavy, pressing against his chest. Finally, he came to a small clearing, and in the center stood an old well, its stones slick with moss. The humming was louder here, emanating from the darkness within the well. Tom approached cautiously, peering over the edge. The well was impossibly deep, the bottom swallowed by shadows. And then he saw it, a pale hand, impossibly long and thin, reaching up from the darkness. He stumbled back, heart racing, but his feet wouldn't move. Something unseen held him in place as the hand gripped the edge of the well, followed by another. Slowly, a figure began to climb out. Its body was twisted, gaunt, its eyes empty sockets that still somehow fixed on him. The humming turned into a low, guttural growl. Tom finally broke free from whatever had held him and ran, branches whipping his face and arms as he sprinted through the trees. The growling followed, echoing around him, as though the creature was everywhere at once. When he burst out of the woods and into the safety of his backyard, he collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath. The growling had stopped. The forest was silent again. He looked back, half expecting to see the creature, but the woods were still. Tom didn't sleep that night. He locked every door and window, his heart racing at every creak of the house. By dawn, he convinced himself it had been his imagination, a trick of the darkness and his overactive mind. But then, the footprints appeared. They were muddy and elongated, not quite human, leading from the edge of the woods to his back porch. Tom followed them with trembling hands to the door, where they stopped. On the glass was a single smeared handprint, too large to belong to anyone he knew. That night, as he sat in his living room with every light on, the humming began again. It was faint, coming from outside. He grabbed a flashlight and cautiously looked out the window. The backyard was empty. The humming grew louder. He turned, and the blood froze in his veins. There, at the far end of the hallway, stood the figure from the well, its empty eyes locked on him. It tilted its head and whispered, "You shouldn't have come." Tom's scream echoed into the night, but no one heard. When Mrs. Harwood went to check on him the next morning, the house was empty. The front door was ajar, and muddy footprints led from the living room back into the woods. She didn't follow them. She knew better.
Story number 8.
Jenna was an artist, a painter who loved solitude. When she inherited her late aunt's cottage in the countryside, it seemed like the perfect place to focus on her work. The house was old, with creaking floorboards and ivy crawling up its stone walls, but it had charm, and more importantly, peace. The one oddity was the room in the attic. Jenna discovered it on her first day, a small, windowless space with faded wallpaper and a single wooden rocking chair in the center. The chair looked ancient, its wood worn smooth from years of use. What struck her as strange was the way the chair always seemed to face the corner, no matter how many times she moved it. She ignored it at first, chalking it up to gravity or the uneven floorboards. Days passed, and Jenna settled into her routine. She spent her mornings painting by the large kitchen window and her evenings reading by the fire. The attic room was out of sight, out of mind. But then the knocking started. It came at night, soft and rhythmic, like someone gently tapping on wood. At first, Jenna thought it was the old house settling or maybe a tree branch against the roof. But as the nights went on, the sound grew louder, more insistent, and it was always directly above her bedroom, the attic. One evening, fed up with the noise, Jenna grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. She pushed open the creaky door and shone the light into the room. The rocking chair was still there, facing the corner. It was perfectly still. "Just the wind," she muttered, but her voice wavered. She turned to leave, but the moment she closed the door, the knocking started again. This time, it was accompanied by a faint creak, like the sound of the rocking chair moving. Jenna's heart raced as she opened the door again. The chair was no longer facing the corner. It had turned to face her. She backed away, slamming the door shut and locking it. For the rest of the night, the knocking and creaking continued, echoing through the house. The next day, Jenna couldn't focus on her painting. The memory of the chair haunted her, and every creak of the house set her nerves on edge. She decided to get rid of it. She dragged the chair out of the attic, down the stairs, and into the backyard. It was heavier than it looked, and the wood seemed to groan under her grip, as if it didn't want to leave the house. She chopped it to pieces with an axe, each swing fueled by a growing sense of unease. When she was done, she threw the splintered wood into a fire pit and set it ablaze. The flames roared to life, consuming the chair until nothing was left but ash. That night, for the first time in weeks, the house was silent. Jenna fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, but at 3 a.m. she woke to the sound of creaking. Her heart sank as she realized it was coming from the attic. Gripping a flashlight, she crept up the stairs, her hand trembling as she unlocked the attic door. The room was empty, no rocking chair, no knocking, just the faded wallpaper and an eerie stillness. Relieved, she turned to leave, and then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic creak coming from behind her. Slowly, she turned her flashlight toward the corner of the room. The rocking chair was back, intact, swaying gently, and in it sat a figure, a shadowy silhouette with hollow eyes and a crooked smile. It tilted its head, staring at Jenna, and spoke in a voice that was neither male nor female, young nor old. "You shouldn't have burned me." Jenna screamed and ran, but the house seemed to stretch endlessly. Every door she opened led back to the attic, where the chair sat waiting. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the figure standing, its shadow stretching toward her. When the real estate agent came to check on the house weeks later, Jenna was gone. The attic door was open, and the rocking chair sat in the corner, swaying gently on its own.